Welcome back to another edition of Silicon Bites, and this is the second part of a two-parter, and it is on the Wizard of the Kremlin, Vladislav Surkov. If you haven't seen the first episode and you get to the end of this one, then please do go back and listen to that. I promise it'll still make sense, and hopefully you'll get some value out of both of those episodes. Before we jump into it, thank you to everyone who is supporting the channel through Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee, and especially to all of you who've been helping our campaign again to raise money to buy trucks to send to Ukraine from the UK. These are then kitted out in Lviv. They are armor plated, painted, checked over, and sent to the battle lines in order to help Ukraine remain resilient against Russian aggression. Thank you also to everyone who has been supporting our fundraiser. And this is to help me at least next week go out and start filming the first part of the documentary film. We're going to be accompanying a aid convoy around Ukraine. We are going to be filming, doing interviews, and creating as much so-called B-roll as we can for the documentary film, and videoing a daily diary along the way as well, which will be published upon our return. I won't be able to publish it while I'm out there, because there is a certain block on being able to sort of upload stuff. And of course, you don't want to ping on the mobile phone network with a foreign SIM. So all that stuff will be uploaded upon my return to the UK. Well, thank you for those sticking with those announcements. Let's get into today's episode. So in the first part, we introduced Vladislav Surkov. Now, he is an interesting character, a toxic one, but an interesting one, and he's a useful path for understanding the perverse and contradictory heart of contemporary Russia. Exploring a recent interview with Vladislav Surkov conducted with L'Express magazine, that's a French publication, it reveals a secretive, complicated and controversial man. He's known as Putin's Rasputin, the Grey Cardinal of the Kremlin, or he's been termed the puppet master as well. Sourkov is the shadowy advisor who inspired novelist Giuliano da Empoli to write The Wizard of the Kremlin. He can be considered to be the architect of the Russian political system, but who has recently distanced himself from the man he served for 2 decades, Vladimir Putin. No one knows what Surkov is doing today. In the L'Express interview, he avoided the question, and we're going to come to one of his previous interviews as well from 2021, and he kind of dodged that question there too, but laid some rather curious hints. Well, let's have a quick summary of who he is. He is the architect, one of the architects of the post-truth world that we now inhabit. Long before Donald Trump weaponized the term fake news, Surkov was developing, experimenting, and honing these arts. Today, Moscow is using Surkov's techniques to sow political confusion in democracies throughout the Western world. They started in Russia, but this is now one of Russia's main exports. Misinformation and manipulation. A former associate of Surkov said about him, "That's a fashion created and nourished by Surkov, this flavour of postmodernism. Nothing is true. There is no truth. There are only alternative truths." He also rose from nowhere to become the power behind the throne. In Putin's Russia, he invented the concept of sovereign democracy, and this is something you'll hear many of the propagandists talk about. It's something that Dugin refers to a lot. It's a system in which the illusion of democratic choice only has one outcome: the continuation of Putin's rule. One former colleague said of Surkov that Vladimir Putin owes to him much of his success from Surkov's machinations. At the end of his fingers, he controlled the threads of so many political structures. Those structures were so complicated that only Surkov knew where everything was: the opposition, the political parties, MPs, the governors, the creation or closing of political movements or NGOs, the church, the media, civil society. These are all things to be controlled, to be directed, as if you are a producer of an insanely complicated stage show. Well, we'll come back to that idea in a minute. Surkov started his career as a bodyguard to an oligarch, and not just any oligarch, the oligarch of oligarchs, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, once Russia's richest man. He hired Surkov as part of his security detail, but that businessman soon realized that Surkov's talents, his brains, were far more valuable than his brawn. He put him in charge of PR, where he honed his skills in the arts of deception and misdirection at the murky intersection of business and politics. After they fell out, Khodorkovsky ended up in jail, while Surkov helped to run a PR campaign against him. He trained as a theatre director, studying in Moscow before being expelled from that institution, apparently for fighting. Those skills would later come in hand when he controlled both the pro-Kremlin parties and the opposition. Another former Kremlin advisor has said he was thinking about himself as the guy who's running the show, trying to find the place of every actor in his play and his performance. And why are we even doing this episode? Well, that's because he has extraordinary relevance to Ukraine. At one point, he was also trying to control and manipulate the various separatist groups in eastern Ukraine. Of course, ultimately, all had a dotted line back to the Kremlin. Leaked documents from his office in the Kremlin show that Surkov was running a network of activists in eastern Donbass when separatist fighters were waging a war against Kiev with support from Moscow. Say more than just support. A former rebel leader is quoted as saying, "Periodically, I would meet up with Vladislav Surkov. He is one of the cleverest people I've ever met in my life. I sometimes think of him as an actor alone on the stage. I'm watching his show, and at the same time, I'm learning from him the art of politics, the art of the possible." Well, that sounds like the sort of thing that Igor Gherkin might say. I wonder if that is the figure from whom that quote comes from. And final 2 points. Apparently, Surkov is a fan of Tupac Shakur and beat poetry. In his office in the Kremlin, when he had one, he had a framed portrait of the American rap artist alongside a picture of Vladimir Putin. He's also a connoisseur of the abstract artist Jackson Pollock and can recite beat poet Allen Ginsberg by heart in English. While he controlled Russian politics with a combination of artistic cunning and political ruthlessness, he also found time to write lyrics for the Russian rock band Agatha Christie. He is one of the Russian government officials who was recently sanctioned, and upon being sanctioned, his reaction was quite telling. "The only things that interest me in the US are Tupac Shakur, Allen Ginsberg, and Jackson Pollock. I don't need a visa to access their work. I lose nothing." And the last bit of background information is, and this is the bit that actually drew me into studying this figure a little bit more. He wrote a postmodernist novel called Around the Zero, or Okolo Nulia. Vladislav Surkov was born as Lamabek Anderbekovich Dadayev in the Chechen Ingush Autonomous Republic, and later changed his name to Vladislav Surkov. He is a Russian businessman, former deputy prime minister of the Russian Federation, and, as we've said, a close advisor to Putin. Under the pen name Dubovitsky, Surkov published a number of works of science fiction, including the gangster fiction novel Okolo Nulia. Surkov initially denied he was the author and wrote a preface to the novel, stating the author of this novel is an unoriginal Hamlet-obsessed hack. Surkov was, of course, subsequently discovered to be, in fact, the author of that work. Around Zero is part dystopian fiction, part twisted confession. The story was published under a pseudonym in 2009 at the height of Surkov's power. The hero is a ruthless gangster publisher, a gun-toting poetry nerd who bribes critics and journalists in the service of corrupt politicians, manipulating the truth to create fake news. Here is a short extract from that. You and you, humans Lions, eagles, and chickens. Do you have enough room? Do you all have enough time? Are you all prepared? Are you all comfortable? Can everyone see everything? Can everybody comfortably see the vast expanse of space into which walk a pair of clowns, a vulgar duo of charlatans, corrupt comics, masters of their craft simply teasing and mocking, tormenting and taunting, also at any moment ready to perform tragedy or pastoral or something of ambiguity. But this idea that everything's a show, this idea that everything is ambiguous, that there's no fixed values, no fixed identities, this is very much the essence of Russia of the 90s, which has merged into a kind of fascistic, postmodern type of fascistic state. Peter Pomerantsev talks and writes about this incredibly compellingly. But also there's maybe some sort of fore echo here as well of a charlatan, a clown, and yet someone who is good at their craft, at least, of spinning vulgar stories and capturing the crowd's attention. There's perhaps something of the foretaste of Donald Trump in this as well. And I will conclude this episode at the end by also wondering what Surkov has been busy doing the last couple of years. And of course, the Trumpian show that we see unfolding and which is busy dismantling the US's soft and hard power, it has an extraordinarily Surkovian feel to it. So here's a couple of insights from an interview, which I think is an absolutely fascinating one. This was an interview between a correspondent of the Financial Times, Henry Foy, and this happened actually in Moscow and is dated June the 18th, 2021. Of course, this is before the full-scale war began. So whatever is said in here, of course, we now have the shadow of history very much reaching over all the words and sentiments of this piece. There are two options, says Vladislav Surkov. The first is Anglo-Saxon. I give you the menu. You can choose what you want. The second option is Russian. There is no choice. The chef chooses for you because he knows better what you want. Surkov, of course, smiles as he says this, according to the journalist that sat down with him. I suggest the Russian option. Surkov was a key figure that helped to strangle Russia's infant democracy and replace it with an enfeebled parody of reality TV. This system, this show, has kept Putin in power for 25 years and counting. Surkov is a founding member of Putinism and one of its key enablers. He's the architect of Russia's sovereign democracy, an ostensibly open system with a closed outcome. Elections are called, candidates campaign, votes are cast, ballot boxes are opened, and the same man wins every single time. Well, that is the very powerful way in which Henry Foy describes the Russian system. In this idea, stability of the state supersedes the freedom of the individual and entails fake opposition parties, rigid control of the media, and impossible barriers to entry for political figures not approved of by the regime, offset by the illusion of democracy and media discourse. Well, this has worked incredibly well. It worked right up until the full-scale war, I would argue, to a greater or lesser extent. Surkov describes the situation. In the Soviet Union, there was a lot of homogeneity, and that homogeneity ruined the Soviet Union because people need diversity. But in the 1990s, we had diversity, and that diversity was ruining Russia even faster. For a while, I was a student at the Institute of Culture. I studied the Commedia dell'arte. There is a limited cast. Pantalone, the merchant. There is the judge, Tartaglia. There is Harlequin, a stupid servant. Brighella, a smart servant. Colombina, the young servant, and so on. There is a limited group of players, but they all represent all the different strata of society. People need to see themselves on stage, says Surkov. In this masked comedy, there is a director, there is a plot. And this is when I understood what's needed to be done. We had to give diversity to people, but that diversity had to be under control. And then everyone would be satisfied. And at the same time, the unity of society would be preserved. This model works. It's a good compromise between chaos and order. I think this is an interesting quote. This is very much the Russian system, and it's one that we really struggle to get our heads around, the idea that you're going to have systemic opposition, that all institutions that are allowed and which receive state funding, anyone who can make it onto the media, anyone who has, say, a show business career or some kind of voice, and that also includes on social media as well. In some way, if you're allowed to broadcast, you're systemic. And there must be some bargain. We don't know the exact mechanics of how it works, but there is some bargain with the state. You will take this role that's been assigned to you in the script, and you can improvise and ad lib around that. And here's the things you'll talk about, and here's the things you can never talk about. This system is exactly something we can actually see. We can see it on the surface, and we can dimly sense the mechanics of it throughout the Russian system. Surkov says an overdose of freedom is lethal to a state. Anything that is medicine can be poison. It's all about the dosage. And this isn't entirely new. In fact, this has deep historical roots. In the 19th century, you may have had more leeway actually to express your opinion and develop a sort of more organic voice as a writer. But ultimately in the Russian state, and if you go too far away from what benefits not just the state, but the imperial construct that the state actually is, then that state will crush you and it will kill you. So systemic or tolerated dissent is a key concept here. And of course, the journalist in a minute picks that out as well. How can you have actual dissent and actual opposition if it's controlled? It's no longer real. It's no longer genuine. It's no longer authentic. Well, this actually is a concept that Sourkov does not even seem to understand or places no weight on, because for him there is no absolute truth. That is almost a meaningless question. He continues, when the change happened, it was absolutely clear to me that the personality of the new leader provided an opportunity. With Putin, I realized everything that I wanted to do could be done now. He describes Putin as a modern-day Octavian, the Roman ruler who succeeded Julius Caesar. Octavian came to power when the nation, the people, were wary of fighting. He created a different type of state. It was not a republic anymore. He preserved the formal institutions of the republic. There was a senate, there was a tribune, but everyone reported to one person and obeyed him. Thus, he married the wishes of the republicans who killed Caesar and those of the common people who wanted a direct dictatorship. Putin did the same thing with democracy, Surkov explains. He did not abolish it. He married it with the monarchical archetype of Russian governance. This archetype is working. It's not going anywhere. It has enough freedom and enough order. Well, this is where I think history starts to judge that system far harsher. Up until 2012, it certainly seemed that that kind of balance was bringing a certain kind of order that was lacking in the 1990s. We can see that in life expectancy and other economic indicators, Russia made remarkable progress despite not having a strong foundation in rule of law or the sort of institutions that we would deem to be absolutely essential to a functioning economy, a sophisticated technology and information-based society. It was making progress on multiple indicators. I don't mean moral indicators or cultural ones, but some of these basic economic indicators. But what Surkov misses out here is that this is not a dynamic system. If you control what's going on, if you control both the opposition and power, if you decide who goes into which roles, there's no true competition. What you have is an extraordinary level of nepotism where only people who are actually fully conscious that they're playing a role agree to take part in this show. It's the opposite of a dynamic innovative, creative society. In fact, it stifles and crushes and starves those forces that are essential. They are the very antithesis, in fact, of Greek and Roman civilization, not a modern day equivalent, which of course he's trying to paint it as. And that system, that Putinist system, creates the illusion of stability, not the actuality of it. And why is that? Because personal power based on a single, fallible human that has no checks and balances, that has no resistance, well, eventually, no matter how smart or cunning that person is, no matter what advice they get from various sources, they will start to close in and they will trust their opinion and a small clique more than any outside evidence, than any kind of information from the outside world. Ultimately, they will make bad decisions. And in the case of a dictator like Putin, those bad decisions usually mean war, destruction, the consumption of economic value on a vast scale, wasting it to an extraordinary extent. We saw the same in Stalin, and we're seeing the same pattern repeated. So this kind of sovereign democracy almost has as its inevitable outcome extreme instability. Sourkov continues, when I started my work in 2000, I suggested a very simple system to bring law and order. We split the opposition into systemic and non-systemic. And what is systemic opposition? That is one that obeys the rules, laws, and customs. He refers here to the parties and many individuals that supposedly speak out against Putin and his actions, but it's quite clear that they are both entirely ineffective, but also they are framed within certain limits, i.e., they cannot act as true opposition and they cannot seek to take power, which should be the very definition of what an opposition seeks to do. It's an opposition that's loyal to those who set the rules. And in fact, in reality, as the correspondent rightly points out, that is no opposition at all. Sourkov comes back at that by saying the second requirement is that they do not work for foreign governments. If they do that, they cannot represent Russians. It breaches our sovereignty, he says. How to exclude it is a matter of taste and depends on the temper of certain people. Here, of course, he's talking about the scale of violence and coercion that a government is prepared to adopt in order to squeeze out foreign influence. And I think he is almost exclusively here referring to authoritarian states, those that would align with Putinism or which are in some way manipulated and controlled by Putinism. Hungary comes to mind, Serbia, and of course there are other examples too. The US possibly also going down this route, although we don't see violence at this point. Outright violence against NGOs and stuff. We do see a form of administrative violence and chaos in the cruel and capricious closing down of US aid, Voice of America, and all other these soft power institutions. Surkov is completely dismisses of this, though. He says the state protects itself everywhere. I'm sorry, I'm saying simple things like a Kremlin propagandist, but this is obvious. In all countries, illegal rallies are crushed by force, or why should we be any different? Again, this stuff is important because in 2011, Surkov moved from the Kremlin to become deputy prime minister. In May 2013, was dismissed from the government. 4 months later, however, he returned, this time as a formal aide to Putin with oversight of Ukraine policy. In February 2014, 5 months after his new appointment, unmarked Russian troops entered Crimea to capture strategic sites and lend muscle to pro-Russian separatists that demanded independence from Kiev. Now, we know that many of these so-called pro-Russian separatists were actually Russian agitators, troops, and nationalists, as well as FSB or GRU agents. A month later, in a referendum declared illegal by the UN General Assembly, the territory voted to become a part of Russia. Simultaneously, pro-Russian groups in eastern Ukraine, supported by Moscow, began taking control of regional institutions and clashing with federal security services, clashes that erupted into full-blown war that, of course, tragically continues to this day. Surkov justifies this by saying Ukrainians are very well aware that for the time being their country does not really exist. I have said that it could exist in the future. The national core exists. I'm just asking the question as to what the borders or the frontier should be. Now, of course, this is a subject of full-scale war. Russia has not had an international discussion or conversation about it, but has launched a full-scale invasion. But that may always have been the idea, and Surkov may always have been aware that that was a possibility, because he says here, two bones need soft tissue between them. Ukraine is between Russia and the West, and geopolitical gravity of both will sever Ukraine. Until we reach that outcome, the fight for Ukraine will never cease. It may die down, it may flare up, but will continue inevitably. Well, this is why I wanted to bring this phrase up in this video at the time where we're talking about negotiations and ceasefires and whether Washington is being played by Russia or not. We have to keep in mind that the expansion of the Russian Empire and this sense that it is in an eternal battle, eternal war between its so-called values, its sovereign democracy that actually it wants to export those techniques and that worldview, as long as the West adheres to our values, which are democratic representation, economic, political, cultural freedom, etc., diversity, and all the other things we supposedly strive to achieve, then Moscow will see conflict between us and them as inevitable, part of an internal dynamic until one declines and one supersedes the other. Sourkov describes the Minsk agreements, a peace deal signed between Moscow, Kiev, and pro-Russian rebels, in fact, that with a tremendous amount of pressure from some European countries. He talked about that as an act that legitimized the first division of Ukraine. Again, think of this in more of an 18th and 19th century method. Russia was involved in multiple partitions of Poland as it sought to reduce the power and influence of that state on the continent of Europe. Russia is thinking of Ukraine as a series of multiple wars and attacks until it gets its own way. Again, we have to bear this in mind. Surkov is completely unrepentant. I am proud that I was part of this reconquest, he says. This was the first open geopolitical counterattack by Russia against the West, and it was such a decisive one. That was an honor for me, he says. Could we have done better? Of course we could, but we've got what we have got. In this interview, he then talks about the sort of quality of the media manipulation and propaganda. And I think part of this discussion is accepting that there is some sort of high cultural level, that would be the sort of geopolitical planting of narratives, but actually the bulk of it is at the opposite end of the scale. He says you are not going to feed people with some high intellectual discourse. Most people eat simple foods. Generally, most people consume very simple, meaning beliefs. This is normal. There is haute cuisine and there is McDonald's. Everyone takes advantage of such people all over the world. Yet at some point, his methods, and indeed his personality, saw him fall from favour. He had become, in his own words, too odious, perhaps also too prominent. He asserts his departure from the Kremlin was mutual, that the fun of dressing up a one-party state as a democracy had gone. In 2000, it was unbelievably exciting, he says. It was for the first time. Everyone said, wow. And then they start asking, well, what else? What next? I had built this car, but I got bored of driving. It needed people who were more patient, sitting at their desks. I am not a driver. Well, Surkov has mystified Kremlin watchers with his low profile since leaving that role. Neither political exile nor lucrative business appointments. He rebuffs persistent questions in the interviews he's done about when he would return to the fray, when he returned to Kremlin politics and what his next transition would be. Well, that last major interview took place 4 years ago. And of course, a lot has happened since. We've had more than 3 years of full-scale war. And Surkov in that interview hints at what potentially might be on the horizon. Well, he says, let's wait and see. He says, some exciting things are ahead of us. There will be many new dramatic transformations. Yes, I would like to understand when it will happen if I live long enough. When it happens, then I will have a job. And what are we seeing in the last couple of years? We're seeing the steady deconstruction of the US as a coherent world power, able to tell a unified story amongst Americans everywhere. That is fragmenting and fracturing. We're seeing President Trump deconstruct American soft and even hard power in front of us. We are seeing Washington adopt more of a extreme imperial transactional view of the world, which is far closer to Putinism than it is to, say, the values which the European Union, the UK, and other genuine democracies would claim to be their values. We are also seeing a concerted attack on NATO and the EU, an attempt to divide and diminish and perhaps abolish those institutions, because out of all of the world's institutions, they are some of the most solid in preventing a firm barrier to Russian expansion. That's physical expansion and the expansion of its influence. And here we come to a couple of interesting phrases from the most recent interview, and this is the one that we covered in the previous episode. Surkov says the EU was founded in 1992, immediately after the collapse of the USSR. Your union was built on the ruin of ours. Now, if we take Surkov's various pronouncements, when you strip away the cultural and literary allusions, what you have is someone who is expressing an extreme nationalist point of view, an extreme Russian imperialist, even genocidal point of view. There is a sort of core of belief, actually, a set of values. They're almost entirely negative, but they are kind of there. Ironic from the person who seems to be claiming he believes in nothing and acts based on no firm convictions. And I think this gives a hint of what he may have been involved in. And there's no evidence for this at all, but the deconstruction of the EU, the deconstruction of NATO, rolling back of the limits on the expansion of Russian power and influence. This is exactly what you'd want to turn the talents of someone like Sourkov to, and the extraordinary success which they seem to be achieving makes me think that perhaps somehow there are some fairly substantial brains involved in this process. This has gone to the head of your politics, he says. The EU began to expand in a frenzied and I would say imprudent manner. It's favoured quantity over quality. The result is a governance structure that is obese, overly collegial, and produces nothing but half measures. In this context, we've seen the emergence of generations of European politicians whose speciality is half measures. Now, Europe must decide whether it is a state or not. The member countries have delegated their sovereignty to the EU, but not entirely. This is extraordinary from a Kremlin propagandist hearing arguments that wouldn't be out of place in, I would say, some of the more intellectual end of the Brexit debate. So that's kind of quite extraordinary to hear that. And there's a little bit of truth there. We see that in the attempts by the EU to push back against Russian aggression, it's difficult to muster so many countries, especially when some of them are aligned with the Kremlin, such as Hungary. He kind of has a point here, but I rather think he's not looking at this as a dispassionate political observer, but rather he's looking at it as a hunter who would try to assess the weaknesses of his prey so in order that he can bring it down more efficiently to consume it. And then he adds to that. He says we must give them, he means the EU, a chance to save the great European culture. And he goes on, we must give them, he means Europe, a chance to save the great European culture, which is a cousin of Russian and American culture. Our victory in Ukraine will change us and the West. It will be a new step towards the integration of the Great North. And this is where I take an extreme issue, actually. Um, it may even be deemed Russophobic. Russia has borrowed, Russia has acquired, Russia has copied aspects of European culture. It has internalized some of these superficial aspects of that. It has produced literature which gives all the sort of form of being sophisticated European culture. But we must remember this is very new, this is very recent, and quite a lot of the physical culture in Russia, the architecture, the engineering, the European painting, and so on, these skills are purchased often. These are the sort of trappings of status rather than Russian civilization internalizing the mechanisms that produced European culture, art, and history. I would say Russia is not part of that culture. It aspires to be, but it fundamentally misunderstands Europe. So there is no great commonality of Northern European cultures. There is no commonality between Russia and, say, Rome, a great Southern European culture, which again it aspires to be not in terms of sort of reproducing the greatness, but purely in terms of the sort of status as it sees. Civilization is a pecking order in the Russian understanding here. There can only be great civilizations. There's no such thing as minor or national civilizations. And rather than civilization being something like a tide that lifts all boats, it's really seen as something where you compete to be greater than one civilization or another. It's a narrow, selfish, quite a small-minded view of what civilization is, what it can achieve. And it has no interest actually in the mechanisms and mechanics that actually produced the results of civilized societies. And again, Surkov seems to have no interest in that at all. But he does have a rather curious view about what the future holds. He says that in the future, the West will become more authoritarian and Russia less so. The proportions of freedom and discipline in our political systems will converge. This may not happen overnight, but it will be achieved at the cost of conflict and tragedy. But it is certain that the United States, Europe, and Russia will achieve a high degree of mutual understanding and cooperation. It is a question of the survival of the great Nordic civilization, he says, to which the Russian, European, and American cultures belong against a background of almost unbearable demographic pressure from the South. Well, this, unfortunately, I think is not a productive view of civilization or indeed the world. And if Russian world values are going to be exported and are going to subsume our own, or at least be merged with our own, then I think what we will see and what we are seeing in the US is extreme division, extreme conflict. We do not have the same mechanics as Russia does, the same ability to hold contradictory thoughts in our heads, to be the sort of puppets of rulers, to acquiesce into that kind of pantomime farce. Well, we have some people who will go along with that, but actually to try and impose the Russian system or export the Russian system to Europe, the UK, and the US, this will actually result in huge destabilization and conflict. Again, that's possibly what Russia wants. It's possibly what Surkov envisages as the outcome of that. Liberalism, he says, and liberal democracy are not dying, but the idea that they are intrinsically superior to other systems is dead. And here, I think, we are guilty, perhaps, of doing part of this work ourselves. I think systems that encourage innovation and freedom of various forms are superior to authoritarian systems. They produce better results. They produce more happiness. They produce more material goods. They produce better standards of living. And they bring into the world new ideas and new works that weren't there before. And I think this is something we should not be ashamed of, that the pursuit of liberalism, the pursuit of liberty and innovation is not something to be embarrassed about, not something that we feel we have to make excuses for and deny or feel guilt about. In this sense, we have done some of Russia's heavy lifting to denigrate and dismiss the very foundations of what is healthy in our societies. And here we come to the end of this episode, and I'll end with this quote from Sourkov. He has been said, and including this episode, as someone who certainly was pivotal in creating Putinism, and he's been asked whether Putinism has been adapted in terms of Trumpism in the United States. He says when Trump was first elected, several very serious American media publications produced articles that claimed that Trump's team used my, Surkov's, propaganda methods and some of my political ideas. I don't know whether this is the truth, a half-truth, or a post-truth. At the time, the President of the United States publicly declared, and I quote, "The future belongs not to globalists, but to patriots. The free world must embrace its national roots, which are irreplaceable. If you want democracy, cling to your sovereignty." In short, these are the principles of sovereign democracy as I formulated them in the 2000s. They became the conceptual basis of Putinism. And I think we do need to ask the serious question. We can see traces of this system in Orbanism, in Hungary's manipulation of the system. In Hungary, we see Georgia Dream adopting many of these ideas, as well as the toolkit of methodologies. And now we see similar processes unfolding in the States. And I think they exist on two levels. They exist as a toolkit which authoritarians can use in order to roll back democracy and gain power. At the same time, and this is why they are so pernicious, they also work to weaken and divide societies where those tools start to be used by one or other of the political parties. This also, I think, is intentional. So not only is Russia exporting, propagating its own way of doing business and seeing the world, it is helping authoritarians around the world to gain power, to maintain power, to entrench power, and at the same time, it is weakening and undermining its adversaries. It's a smart strategy. It's a pernicious strategy. It's an evil strategy, in fact, from our perspective. If you actually hold true that innovation and freedom are absolutes and things that should be aspired to, then this is a kind of kryptonite to those. And it is the very cleverness of what Russia has achieved in the last couple of years and the results we are seeing now in the US that lead me to believe that Surkov almost certainly has something to do with it.